I appreciate that Aaron read the words from Beverly Scaff's book. I appreciate particularly that Aaron read the words from Beverly Scaff's book because Aaron does things so well, but also because it's appropriate when the small group of mighty people that came together to try to make something new realized they could probably use a little help on Sunday mornings. They turned to two-star King students. So we're continuing that tradition to have Aaron read those words. But I also appreciate that Aaron read those words because those words make me tired. I too remember what it's like to be at that very beginning stage of making church. And it was hard. It was hard like sitting on the ledge of a stone fireplace in a small room, a room so small that some of us younger ones had to sit on the fireplace. The group was so excited about gathering a new community. It was hard like not having enough money to pay the rent for the church and deciding after year 2 that maybe it would be a good idea if the church just met in the living room of the house that was rented for the minister. Not a good idea, can I just say, in case anyone is considering that, but just saying. It was hard, like what it's like to bring a diverse community of people, all who have their own idea about what it is that you're creating, and keeping them all in the same place. I remember facilitating a meeting when I was 8 months pregnant on a flip chart, going down to the bottom, writing the flip chart, and realizing I couldn't get up. And it was hard because it gave me a lifelong fear of big blue plastic bins. Other people have these adversarial reactions to, like, rituals of other religions, other icons from their childhood and early religious years. I am really always afraid when I see those big blue bins because in that church for those years, we had to pack everything into the bins. We had to unpack it all to create church. And then we had to pack it all back into the bins, put it in the trunk of the car, take it home, put it in the garage or not. And every week, week after week after week. So I appreciate that Aaron read those words. We didn't know, I realized as we were sitting there in that living room that first time, we didn't know really what it was we were creating. We knew we wanted to create something, but it wasn't something we really knew because it didn't really have a roadmap. We were sitting in the living room of Lois and T.J. Anderson. T.J. is a contemporary black composer who turned 90 this year. He's also was the chair of the committee that brought us our gray hymnal. So he's a UU of long standing and chaired that committee, probably the last hardback hymnal we may ever have in this world. So we knew very little then as that group, and just as the group that began the group that led to the group that began the group that became this congregation, just as they were as well. The numbers were small, the frustrations were legion, and while it seemed important work, it was a lot of work because we really didn't actually know what we were doing. We could only imagine that we had some idea. So I can truly say I want to honor the level of commitment that was here in those early years. 68 years ago today, when that first group first met. And I'm glad that we are beginning a tradition of honoring it every year because we should always remember those upon whose shoulders we are. I think that it takes some doing to be one of those people that went through what in the South, back in the South, we used to call the begats, the group that begat, the group that begat, the group that begat. We have in our knowing, I think, among us, all of us, the knowledge of what it means to truly put your heart and your soul, your spirit and your passion into something that you want to help create. And what we know is it wasn't just those people who joined in the first 30 years, but those who came after, who kept doing that in many, many ways. Everybody remembers what it's like, or has that experience, or has considered that experience of what it's like to put yourself before something that is larger than you and make that part of what you do. For many people, I suspect it wasn't founding a church, or we'd have a lot more of them, but many of us have some kind of overriding passion which commands us. And you and I are here because of the people who met in that living room and in the Women's Club and in the Red Cross and in the Pine Street building and all those different places before they came to this place and found this property and made home here. Aren't we often in our lives beneficiaries of people who came before us, who did things out of their own passion, who left us legacies that we then now have to enrich our lives. People who were willing to risk, even though there wasn't a clear way forward. People who were willing to commit, even though some days it really didn't seem like it was worth it, all those blue bins. For more than a decade, I've heard the people who were involved in those early days, and their children too, when I'm planning celebrations of life, talk about what they were so passionate about creating, a new kind of place, a new kind of community for their time. What they were looking for was a sort of belonging, something that none of them had experienced before. And I want us to take a moment and consider how radical it was in its time, because that's really important to consider. You know, this was a place that people came together even though they weren't all Protestant. Some of them were Catholics, which in the 1950s was not something that everyone was completely accepting of, if those of us remember when we had a presidential candidate who was Catholic and some of the things that were said, right? There were people who were of Jewish ancestry in the mix. There were black people who not only were part of the mix, but they also were leaders in the congregation. It was a place where a range of people dared to call themselves wild and socially unacceptable things like atheist, agnostic, scientific thinker, to explore religious education, the idea that we could learn from the text of our life rather than just one set of narrow scriptures. And adults could learn from something called the human potential movement, which every person I've talked to has a different interpretation of what that was about. It was a place of imagination and thinking outside the box. It was a place for its time and its age. And was it worth all the effort? I think we who sit here today would say, yes, it is, and thank you to those who put that effort forward. Because with the idealism of their then young adulthood, they were looking for a place to belong and to co-create. In the 1950s, the edges of the world were pretty sharp, but they were beginning to blur, and there were some who were ready to blur them, preparing for those seismic changes that were about to roll in. And we're in another of those times today, maybe further along in the changes, when many people find themselves needing to be in new kinds of space in the spirit of the word paradox, which at its root mean contrary to popular belief. Those people were, in fact, contrary to popular belief. Mediative and peacemaking author John Paul Lederich writes, "There is a nuance which accompanies the root etymology of the word paradox. It suggests that para refers to something that's outside or beyond common belief, as opposed to something that is an outright contradiction of what is perceived to be true. The concept of a paradox suggests that truth lies in, but also beyond, what is originally perceived." And I think that's really true for those who take bold efforts to make something new. The gifts of paradox, he says, provides an intriguing capacity. It holds together seemingly contradictory truths in order to locate a larger truth among them. Like the adventurers of every age, those who founded this place were trying to locate that greater truth, to build new bridges, if you will. And peacemaking, of course, is part of the DNA of this congregation. This year will, in fact, mark the 60th anniversary of the Peace and Justice Center as well. So I ask you again to think about when you embarked on such a venture in your life, something bigger than you knew it could be, or perhaps it's a venture that you're still thinking about. What was it you were trying to create without an exact picture of where you're going, no roadmap, no blueprint? What was it that you cared so much about that you were willing to work against odds to shape it into being? Perhaps it's not in your past. Perhaps it's in your present or in your future. I know several of you that are working on these things right now. New business ventures, ways to help your neighbors, a new vision of family outside of the one that you inherited. What is it that something in you still longs to help co-create? You know, I believe that co-creation is at the heart of our faith. And people sometimes ask me actually quite often right now in the times that we're living in, whether I have any concept, whether Unitarian Universalists have any concept of evil. The second question That's a really long thing about whether any Unitarian Universalists have any concept of evil. There's probably any number of combinations of that, but I most certainly do, and I think about it often. And it's based on the ideas of some of the thinkers who were coming up in the 1950s, right about the time that this congregation was being formed. Unitarian thinkers who were beginning to ask how it could be that the divine or the sacred, the holy, whatever name you want to give it, was really found not so much in the embodiment of some kind of personification, but in a process of co-creation and evil. Evil was anything that got in the way of that co-creation. What is tricky, of course, is that we have many ways to block co-creation. We can refuse to engage with one another. We can forget our larger purpose that we're going towards. We can injure one another in intentional and often unintentional ways. We can erect walls, and they can be around false ideas, around false news, the nemesis of healthy and direct communication. This is an evil I believe in because I see it often in many places, inside and outside our walls. I can recognize it because I can be its bearer. We all can. It's a kind of evil I know that we are all capable. I certainly know that I am capable of, often unintentionally, especially when we forget that we belong to one another. John Powell is one of the people who lives on the other side of the tunnel, where apparently it is more moist, because it's drier over here. And he was a speaker at a major conference just a few weeks ago, earlier this month. He was introduced at that conference as one of our nation's public intellectuals. And he noted that he's part of the Haas Institute at UCal Berkeley. He notes that this is another time when we are thinking about what it means to belong or not to belong. He says, there are two competing visions or stories that are emerging in our world today. And they've always been there, but now they're taking on sharper relief. One story is about a smaller and smaller we, one that's hierarchical and based in fear and control and exploitation. This is a notion that only we, some very small we, count. But he goes on to say that as he's worked globally, he realizes that who that small we should be really depends on your context. In this nation, we might define it by how much you own or what your heritage is. In other countries, he says, it might be sometimes it's because you don't have the right number of cows, or sometimes it's because you talk with a different accent than I do. You know, in the 1950s, conversations were beginning about whether women were part of the we, about whether people who didn't agree with the traditional doctrines of religion could be part of the we of moral and ethical people in the world who make a difference. The we that was shaped here didn't have a clear blueprint in the 1950s, and it doesn't in the first quarter of this century either. We determine it for good or for evil. And I'm really glad today that as we're having this service, we have Mark Chase here in his first role as worship associate. His first time being our worship associate, one of our newer members. Really glad to have that. That's really wonderful. And in the out among you today are several of our newest members who are getting to hear about this heritage. I think that's important. Powell goes on to say, the other vision is an expanding we, where we share with each other, we share the earth, we share our dreams, we learn to care and even love each other in our similarities and in our differences. One is an expanding we, what I call the circle of human concern. The other is a contracting we, where we start to kick people out of the circle. You don't belong, and you don't belong, and you don't belong, he says. These visions compete with each other across our globe right now. They're not just different visions. They're completely different concepts about who is in that we. And this is a spiritual journey, as well as a political journey and a cultural journey. Do we see one another? In the words of that greeting we used, do we see one another? Can we connect with one another? Paul Lederick, from his global peacemaking experience, says that building bridges requires not just technical skills. He says when he first got into peacemaking, he thought it was all about knowing all the technicalities of mediation. And he's come to believe that it actually requires more than anything else what he calls moral imagination. He's clear that his idea of morality is not based in a single set of predetermined religious values set in one tradition. He says, the moral imagination is something larger. It refuses to frame life's challenges, problems, and issues as dualistic polarities. He says its fundamental approach holds multiple, even competing needs and perspectives together at the same time. It is built on a capacity to imagine that it is possible to hold multiple people's realities and worldviews simultaneously as part of a greater whole without losing one's identity and without needing to force or impose one's view on the other. It pursues complexity as a friend rather than as an enemy. I think this is a time in which we are all called to do this in our own lives as well, to build on our hope for our times and hold that right next to the fears that we feel in these times. Our world is in a time of paradox and disruption, and this beloved community is not immune. A number of the people on the list that I read today have offered me just such a great gift in this last year. They've offered me the gift of comfort, sometimes sidling up to me quietly or inviting me to talk with them to say that, you know, this congregation is no stranger to controversy. In the past, we've had times when we've had to choose, will we build a wall or will we build a bridge? For this reason, we know we are here today because enough of the people who've come through these doors have made the choice to build a bridge time after time, age after age, issue after issue, generation after generation, as it happens. We know also that this has been true within our larger tradition with its 500-year-old commitment to an expanding idea of how we find truth, what truth is, and who the we is that can share it. The spiritual work is found in the paradoxical, in embracing the intellectual and emotional rigor of multiple positions. And this is what Lederich says is clear in his work of peacemaking, bridge building. It's not just sweetness and light. Sometimes it is really hard work. John A. Powell says this, belonging is not simply joining something. Belonging is about co-creating the thing you're joining. In order to co-create, you need power. It's not your house or my house. It's not your city or my city. It's our city. We co-create it. We make it together with all of our complexities and dreams, and that's a very different process, he says. Inclusion isn't enough. Belonging not only affects how we perceive things, it affects who we are. I'm here because you are. The people who are here among us today are not just founders, they were co-creators, and all of those who came after and stayed as well. The question of this age are questions of belonging. And as a boss of mine used to say, perhaps it is true that there is nothing new under the sun. I know that today among us, there is a person who feels really overwhelmed by change and the way the world is moving and all the things that are hard to understand and different. I know there's someone who's frustrated. I know there's someone who's angry. There's the person also who is afraid, but afraid in this person's heart that we'll stop making the changes and progress forward that makes it possible for us to be welcoming and to include them in the we. There's the person who just isn't sure and just wants to come to church and have it be calm and peaceful. But peacemaking isn't always like that. I doubt that those who founded this community would have used the words community of love. No one contested me on that first service either. They may have seemed a little bit soft and maybe a little sentimental back in the days with that fierceness that they had. But I use these words very specifically in the title for this sermon on the day when we launch our first Founders Day, because I believe it is the fierce love of peacemaking, of bridge building, and of co-creation that allows us to be here so many decades later. This congregation has now known almost 7 decades, and in it has passed not just celebration and joy and fun and entertainment and all of that, but also death and loss and change, birth and renewal and hope. All of that has been mixed into the mix, and all of that says that love is not a finite quality. and that a community of fierce love can hold the fears of their times and the hopes right next to each other in that great paradox. The people who founded this place, who we will celebrate with cake and flowers in just a few minutes, prided themselves on what they were not traditional, not mostly believers in traditional Christian orthodoxy, not people that like to live within the social norm. And yet what they may have failed to see, or even maybe to articulate among themselves, was who they were. For they were bridge builders, co-creators, and people of a fierce love. Paradoxical, co-creating, and risk-taking. We do rest on the shoulders of those who come before us, and we have been the place that has not been afraid to live outside of the common knowing, which is not afraid to move towards that greater truth, even when we do not know the path. We are called on in our times to carry forth this legacy, I believe, by entering into our deepest imaginings. We know we don't need a wall. We're not sure that a bridge is going to be enough. The past does teach us this, that a community of deep commitment and good heart widens the circle of belonging. And we are the only ones for this community that can make it so.